and I wanted to find out why all these various really critical subject matter vectors, if you will, all converged and passed through that one event. So the question is, how do you beat the system? And the answer is you don't. You go around it. It's called the made man principle, and that's how the banking system works. They will not loan money to anybody who won't agree to falsify the securities. Otherwise, you could go into a court of equity and sue them for the fraud they've committed against you. But by making you a party to the offense, you can no longer sue them. But there is one exception in 400 years that I discovered in South Africa, and that's what led me there in the first place. It's called Burroughs versus Rhodes and Jameson. It's kind of a nexus. If you, I take these, various subjects that are important to how the system works, like the concept of intergenerational transference of wealth, inheritance, that sort of thing. That's sort of job one on the entrenched money power. So you go back and you look at how that's changed over 1,000 years from, say, the year 1000 to the year 2000. And you get a certain vector or a certain, line of reasoning and thought and where it's headed into. Now, you got about 3 or 4 of those things that are really, really important. And for whatever reason, they all seem to converge on Johannesburg in 1895. And an event known as the Jameson Raid, when Cecil Rhodes tried to cause an uproar or an insurrection to overthrow the Transvaal government in 1895, and it led to the Boer War, and then which led to the First World War, et cetera, all that. And so I was fascinated by and thinking about it, and then I had the opportunity to go there, and I wanted to find out why all these various really critical subject matter vectors, if you will, all converged and passed through that one event. I don't know, I must have read 100 books while I was there. Study the history, and you realize that it was all about the wealth, the gold and the diamonds. Is it just coincidence that in the previous 15 years, the largest single deposit of diamonds and gold on Earth had been found in this area, and then within a matter of 15 years, a major war breaks out? What are the odds? Who could have imagined? Cecil John Rhodes and his friend, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, they tried to create an uprising to overthrow the Transvaal government in 1895 in Johannesburg, and they wanted to start an insurrection, and so Cecil spent about £250,000, which was just an immense sum in those days, outfitting an army of 1,500 police officers who he deceived into believing they were in a training exercise, and that suddenly they got this emergency communication. They were on the border of the Transvaal Republic in what is today Botswana, but about 150 miles away from Johannesburg, and they suddenly get this emergency notice saying there's an uprising going on in Johannesburg. English women and children are being massacred by the Boers, and we need help. Please come to our aid. And so they all go in, and they've got, as luck would have it, they've got 3 cannon with them. I think it was 500 men on horseback. And they were all like Northwest Mounted Police in Canada at the time, or the RCMP. They were police officers working for the Crown. But it failed. It was cartoonishly inept. And they even had traveling circuses that lampooned it after the fact, because it was such a comedy of errors. It was it was the end of Cecil Rhodes' political career. It was the end of it would have brought down the British government too, because Joe Chamberlain, the prime minister, was in on it, but he managed to claim he didn't know a thing about it, and he got away with it. But nonetheless, one of the officers who was involved in the raid, there were I think there were 16 people, 16 men were killed. 12 of them were among the police officers who had been duped into this ridiculous raid that was supposed to create a civil war and an uprising and overthrow the Paul Kruger, who was the president of the Transvaal Republic. And it went, but anyways, this guy he was injured, he lost a leg, and he spent a year in a concentration camp where he was legally a mercenary, considered a mercenary. He wasn't treated very well. And then he was finally released and made his way back to London. And he tried to sue Cecil Rhodes in equity for the tort of deceit or whatever, for deceiving him into doing this thing. And Cecil did what was called a demurrer, which is a form of it's a trial before a trial to determine whether the plaintiff has the capacity to sue. And in one of the conditions is you have to have clean hands if you want equity. So if you want to sue somebody for equity, you can't be. That's why one criminal can't sue another. And okay, now what they were violating was called the Foreign Enlistment Act, and it was strict liability. And so it didn't matter that the soldiers had been tricked into participating; they were still technically guilty of violating the Foreign Enlistment Act. Cecil's defense and Rhodes is called Burroughs versus Rhodes and Jameson. His defense is that, well, and that's the thing about a demurrer, is that solely for the purpose of testing the jurisdiction, the plaintiff concedes the facts argued by the defendant, or the defendant concedes the facts offered by the plaintiff. So Cecil says, all right, I'm willing to concede that he's got a case that says I tricked him into doing this, but under the law, we are both guilty of the same offense, and therefore neither one of us can sue the other. Okay, now the thing is that the eyes of the world, he might have actually won that argument in any other time and place. But here, the eyes of the world were on the English court because it was such a fiasco and such a ridiculous lampoon thing, and it made the Crown look foolish. It made Cecil Rhodes look foolish. It destroyed him financially, and well, not totally financially, but you see, the problem was that he was the prime minister of the Cape Colony. So it would be the same as Justin Trudeau hiring private mercenaries to go in and overthrow the government of Mexico. Be somewhat politically embarrassing if he got caught, and especially if you send in 1,500 soldiers and they were all rounded up and captured. Okay, so anyways, the judges of the courts all came to the same conclusion. It was an appellate court by the time, and so you had three judges, and they all said the same thing, that normally that is the rule, but we are going to make an exception. And it was the only time in the 400 years that I'm aware of at the time, in all the cases I was able to locate, there was only this one exception, and that was that where a manifestly stronger party fraudulently induces a manifestly weaker party to joint participation in a strict liability criminal offense, the weaker party can still maintain standing before a court of equity to sue the stronger party who fraudulently induced them to participate. Based on that decision, that means that every mortgage in the world flips, and not only does it wipe out $150 trillion worth of debt, but the bankers owe $150 trillion refund pro rata to everybody who's got a mortgage. So if you've actually got a mortgage, you are, for $1 million, not only is that you own the house, the mortgage is null and void, and the bank owes you $1 million refund, plus everything that you've ever paid it in terms of principal and interest payments. But you think the courts are going to, because it's the lawyers who are responsible. So, at any rate, it's getting kind of silly, as what I've said, because they think that nothing can be done about it. And so what happens is, over 30 years, it has just gone one step after another because nobody ever reads the mortgages. I'll bet anybody out here, how many of you seriously went over your mortgage with a fine-tooth comb before you signed it? And even if you did, most of you aren't going to understand because they're very clever at the words they use. Virtually every word in finance means the opposite of what you think it means. They keep giving themselves away because they don't understand that they're criminals. It's like, so if you've got $1 million mortgage in 1980, you would just trade it for these bonded equity exchange credits. and that's why you publish the equity lien. And that's what Werex does. Werex has published an equity lien on the legal title to all the paper you ever, or no, the equity title to all the paper you ever gave to the bank.
Amazing.
And so the question is, how do you beat the system? And the answer is you don't. You go around it.